Alara was 22 when her father died, and her inheritance was tallied. After her stepmother, Brenda, and Brenda's 2 grown sons had picked the house clean, taking the truck, the savings accounts, the antique furniture, the generator, even the good copper pots that had been her grandmother's, Alara was left with a 1/4-acre plot of forgotten land 2 miles out of town. On it sat a derelict stone springhouse, choked with poison ivy and leaning like a tired old man. The county tax assessor valued the parcel at $500, a sum so pitiful Brenda had laughed when the lawyer read it aloud. She signed the deed over with a flourish, a gesture of magnanimous charity that fooled no one. "There," she'd said, sliding the paper across the polished walnut table. "Don't say I never gave you anything." Her sons had snickered. They knew, as Alara knew, that it was not a gift but a final insult, a pile of useless rocks to match the emptiness in her pockets. But her father, Silas, had loved that place, and in his last lucid week, he had pressed a key into her palm and whispered 2 words: the spring. Inside that crumbling stone, he'd promised, was something he had kept for her, something no one else could ever put a price on. But that comes later. First, there was the silence after the funeral. The service was held at the small community church on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of dishwater. The air was thick with the scent of wilting lilies and Brenda's expensive perfume. She sat in the front pew, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, a portrait of dignified grief that cracked every time she glanced at her watch. Her sons, flanking her like bookends, wore identical black suits that were too tight in the shoulders, their faces impassive and bored. Alara sat alone in the second row, a small, still figure lost in the cavernous space of the pew. She didn't cry. The grief was a solid thing lodged in her chest, too heavy for tears. In her pocket, her fingers traced the familiar contours of a small river stone, worn smooth by years of her father's touch. It was a strange stone, its gray surface webbed with a faint hexagonal pattern, like a fossilized honeycomb. He had found it in the creek behind the Springhouse when he was a boy, and had carried it his entire life. It was the only thing she had managed to slip from his nightstand before Brenda sealed off his room. The pews were sparsely filled. A few old-timers from town, men with calloused hands and sun-creased necks, who had known Silas for 50 years. They nodded at Alara with a shared, unspoken sorrow. Maeve, their next-door neighbor for as long as Alara could remember, sat across the aisle, her kind, wrinkled face a mask of genuine pain. And then there was the man in the expensive suit who didn't belong. He was tall and silver-haired, his face too smooth, his shoes too shiny for this dusty little town. Alara had seen him before, his pristine white truck parked at the end of their lane, talking to her father. Silas had always come back from those conversations with a tightness in his jaw. The man introduced himself to Brenda after the service as Mr. Thorne, from Agricor. He offered his condolences with a voice as smooth and sterile as a hospital corridor. "Your husband was a man of unique convictions," he said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He glanced at Alara for a fraction of a second, a flicker of assessment, before turning his attention back to Brenda. It wasn't sympathy, it was surveillance. After the meager reception in the church basement, where Brenda held court over a plate of untouched sandwiches, Maeve pulled Alara aside. The old woman's hand was warm and dry, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your father was a good man, child," she whispered, her voice raspy with emotion. "A better man than most folks knew. He wasn't just some fella who sold honey at the market. He was a listener. He listened to the woods, to the bees. They told him things." She squeezed Alara's hand. "That little stone house of his, that was his real church. Don't let them tell you it's nothing." Maeve's words were a small anchor in the swirling chaos of the next week. The stripping away was methodical, a quiet and brutal dismantling of a life. Brenda directed the operation with the efficiency of a battlefield commander. First went the big-ticket items. The John Deere tractor, sold to a neighboring farm before Silas was even in the ground. The Ford F-150, its title signed over to Brenda's eldest, Mark. The woodworking tools in the garage, the table saw, the lathes, the planers, each one a piece of her father's patient soul, were sold as a lot to a dealer from the city for a fraction of their worth. They took the tools, every last wrench and screwdriver. They took the stacks of seasoned black walnut and cherry he had been saving for special projects. They took the handcrafted furniture from the house, the sturdy oak dining table where they had eaten every meal, the rocking chair he'd built for her mother, the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. An estate sale was held on Saturday. Strangers swarmed through their home, their hands touching everything, haggling over photo albums and coffee mugs. Ilara watched from her bedroom window as a woman carried away the chipped porcelain bird that had sat on the kitchen windowsill her entire life. She saw a man load the tire swing her father had hung for her from the big maple into the back of his minivan. Each item leaving was a small amputation. Brenda moved through the crowd with a calculator and a cash box, her face flushed with commerce. She was not mourning a husband, she was liquidating assets. When it was over, the house was a hollow shell, echoing with the ghosts of what had been. The walls were scarred with pale rectangles where pictures had hung. The floors were scuffed from the boots of the movers and the buyers. Brenda sat at the now empty dining room table, counting a thick stack of bills. She didn't look at Ilara. "I've closed his bank accounts," she announced to the empty room. "After paying the funeral expenses and the lawyer, there's not much left." She peeled off a few bills and slid them across the table. 2 20s, a 10, a 5, and a handful of change. This was what was in his wallet, $57.38. "The rest is mine. The house is mine. It's all in my name now." It was a lie, or at least a half-truth, spun from legal documents Silas had been too sick or too tired to contest. Ilara knew it, and Brenda knew she knew it. But Ilara had no money for a lawyer, no energy for a fight. The solid thing in her chest had consumed all her strength. She took the money without a word. She packed her life into 2 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag, clothes, a few books, the box of old photographs she had hidden in her closet, and her father's river stone. The final tally of her inheritance was this: one beat-up 1998 Honda Civic that was legally in her name, 2 boxes of memories, $57 and change, and the deed to a pile of rocks. As she carried her things to the car, Brenda stood on the porch, arms crossed. "You know, he wasted so much time out at that stupid Springhouse," she said, her voice sharp. "Tinkering, mumbling to himself, could have been making real money. Could have sold that land to Agricorp years ago when they first came sniffing around. But he was stubborn, just like his bees, just like you." Ilara didn't answer. She put the last box in her car, got behind the wheel, and drove away from the hollowed-out house without looking back. She didn't know where she was going, not really. She only knew she was driving toward the one thing that was left. Toward the spring. The track leading to the Springhouse was little more than 2 ruts in the earth, overgrown with weeds that scraped against the undercarriage of her car. She parked where the track dissolved into a thicket of blackberry brambles and walked the last 100 yards. The air here was different, cooler. It smelled of damp earth, of moss, of the clean, sharp scent of running water. The Springhouse stood in a small clearing, nestled into the side of a gently sloping hill. It was smaller than she remembered, a single-room structure made of massive, moss-covered field stones, fitted together with the patient skill of a long-dead mason. The roof was slate, and a thick mantle of ivy covered the north wall, its tendrils creeping over the stone lintel above the heavy oak door. It did look like a ruin. Brenda was right about that. It looked forgotten. But her father had not forgotten it. The path to the door was clear, recently trod. The heavy iron hinges, which should have been rusted solid, moved with a surprising smoothness when she pushed. The door swung inward with a low groan, releasing a breath of cool, subterranean air. She stepped across the threshold, out of the humid afternoon and into the deep, quiet shade of the interior. For a moment, she couldn't see. The only light came from two narrow, slit-like windows high on the walls, thick with cobwebs and grime. As her eyes adjusted, the space resolved itself out of the gloom. And it was not a ruin, it was a sanctuary. The air hummed with a low, resonant energy. It smelled of stone and water, yes, but also of something else, something warm and sweet and alive. Beeswax. The floor was made of massive flagstones, swept clean. The stone walls, which looked so rough and random from the outside, were revealed on the inside to be a marvel of dry stack construction, each stone fitting against the next as if it had grown there. A deep channel was cut into the floor, lined with smooth river rocks, carrying a trickle of clear, cold water from a fissure in the back wall across the room and out through a small opening on the other side. This was the spring itself, the source of the place's name and its purpose. But the room was not empty. Against one wall stood a long, sturdy workbench, built from a single slab of black walnut. It was not a piece of furniture, it was part of the room, its legs anchored into the stone floor. On it were not the power tools of a modern workshop, but the quiet, specialized instruments of a forgotten trade. They were smokers with copper fittings, their surfaces patinaed with smoke and time. They were hive tools, bee brushes, and delicate implements of brass and steel whose purpose she couldn't guess. On shelves above the bench were jars of golden honey, each labeled with a date and a series of cryptic symbols in her father's neat, precise hand. There were stacks of wooden frames, meticulously assembled, waiting for wax foundations. Against the opposite wall, there was a row of what looked like wooden cabinets. But as she drew closer, she saw they were observation hives, their sides fitted with panels of glass, though they were all currently dark and empty. This was not a place for storage. It was a laboratory, a place of study, a place of devotion. In the center of the room, positioned so the faint light from the windows fell directly upon it, was a single beehive. It was unlike any she had ever seen. It was crafted from cherry wood, polished to a warm, deep glow. The joints were perfect, seamless. The design was elegant, almost architectural. It was empty, but it felt expectant, waiting. It was a masterpiece, a testament to the thousands of hours of patient labor her father had poured into this hidden world. This was his secret. Not the honey he sold at the farmer's market from the plain white hives behind the house. This was his real work. This place, this silent, waiting hive. A wave of understanding washed over her, so profound it felt like a physical blow. All those times he had disappeared for hours, coming back with dirt on his knees and a quiet, centered look in his eyes. All the money Brenda had accused him of wasting. It had all come here. It had been transformed into this. Into a testament of love and labor, hidden away from a world that would only see its price tag. On the workbench, next to a microscope and a series of hand-drawn charts mapping the bloom times of local wildflowers, was a small, neat stack of leather-bound journals. There were 5 of them, their covers worn soft with use. The top one was open. On the page, in her father's familiar, angular script, was an entry dated just 3 weeks before he died. The queen is ready. The conditions are almost right. I can feel the change in the air, the shift in the light. They will need a new home soon, a new keeper. Her hands trembled as she reached for the first journal in the stack, the one marked with the earliest date, over 20 years ago. She sat on a low wooden stool, the only piece of furniture in the room, and opened it to the first page. The air was cool and still, the only sound the gentle murmur of the spring running through its stone channel, and she began to read. The early entries were a young man's notes, full of wonder and discovery. He wrote about the local bee populations, about the subtle variations in the color and taste of their honey, depending on whether they foraged on clover or goldenrod or the tiny, forgotten blossoms of the jewelweed that grew along the creek. He wrote about the language of their dance, the intricate choreography that communicated the distance and direction of a nectar source. He wrote about the sacred geometry of the comb. And he wrote about her mother, Annalise. He wrote about her laugh, about the way she looked in the morning light, about the wildflower seeds she planted along the edge of the woods. In these early pages, the journals were as much a love letter to his wife as they were a record of his bees. Then the tone began to change. Annalise got sick. A strange, creeping fatigue at first, then tremors in her hands, then a fog that clouded her memory. The doctors were mystified. They ran tests, gave diagnoses that shifted from week to week. Silas's entries grew shorter, tighter, laced with a quiet desperation. He began to document not just the bees, but the world around them. He noted the days the crop dusters flew over the vast cornfields owned by a big agricultural company on the neighboring ridge. He wrote down the chemical names from the warning signs posted on the fences. He started taking soil and water samples, storing them in carefully labeled jars. He believed there was a connection. He saw the same sickness in his hives. Colonies that had been strong for generations were suddenly collapsing. Forager bees were losing their way home. Queens were failing. He saw it as a single poison seeping into the land, into the water, into the bees, into his wife. The entry from the day Annalise died was just 3 words: "The bees are gone." Elara closed the journal, a sob catching in her throat. She had been only 4 years old. Her memories of her mother were faded, dreamlike fragments. No one had ever told her the details. They had only said she'd been sick for a long time. After a few blank pages, the journal entries resumed, but they were different. The youthful wonder was gone, replaced by a grim, focused determination. He began his real work. He had read in an old county almanac about a native strain of bee, the Iron Mountain Black, a hardy, resilient breed that was thought to have been wiped out a century ago by disease and the introduction of more docile European honeybees. But Silas had heard stories from old-timers about pockets of wild, dark bees that still lived deep in the hollows of the mountains. He became convinced that if any bee could survive the modern world's poisons, it was them. He spent years searching. He hiked for miles, following faint trails, marking old bee trees on hand-drawn maps. And one day, he found them. A single, thriving colony in the hollow of a lightning-scarred oak, miles from any farm or road. They were smaller and darker than his other bees, and they hummed at a lower, more resonant frequency. He carefully captured a queen and a small brood and brought them back to the sanctuary of the Springhouse. Here, in secret, he began to cultivate them. It was a slow, patient process, full of setbacks and failures. But he learned their ways. He learned what they needed. He learned that they foraged on plants other bees ignored, the deep-forested medicinals, the wild herbs, the tiny, resilient flowers that grew in the shade of the rocks. And he learned their honey was different. It was dark, almost black, thick like molasses, with a complex, mineral taste that was nothing like the sweet, floral honey he sold at the market. But its properties were what astounded him. In one entry, he described using it to treat a deep, infected cut on his hand that had refused to heal. Overnight, the inflammation was gone. The wound began to close. On a page dated 5 years ago, he had written the words that would become the spine of her new reality. Some things you don't keep for what they're worth. You keep them for what they remember. He wasn't just breeding bees. He was cultivating a living memory, a natural antidote to the poison that had taken his wife and was slowly killing the land. Elara read for hours, until the light from the narrow windows faded to gray. She read about his quiet war against Agricorp, the successor to the company that had poisoned his land. He documented every new chemical they sprayed, every crop rotation, every sterile, perfect field they planted right up to his property line. He chronicled the visits from their representatives, men like Mr. Thorne, who came with smiles and checkbooks, wanting to buy his unproductive land to expand their empire of monoculture. He always refused. The last journal was filled with a growing sense of urgency. His own health was failing. A tremor had appeared in his hands, the same hands that had been so steady for so long. He knew he was running out of time. He had to secure the bees' future. He had to pass the work on. The final entries were a set of instructions, a map of his knowledge, a guide for his successor. For her. A faint scratching sound at the door startled her out of her trance. She stood up, her legs stiff, and pushed the heavy door open a few inches. A pair of sad brown eyes looked up at her. It was Buster, her father's old hound dog. He was a creature of indeterminate breeding, with long, floppy ears and a coat the color of dried leaves. After Silas died, Buster had disappeared, likely driven off by Brenda, who had always hated the dog. He must have been living in the woods, waiting. He whined softly and nudged the door with his nose. Alara opened it wider. "Hey, boy," she whispered, her voice thick. "You came back." Buster padded into the Springhouse as if he had been there 1,000 times before. He circled the room once, sniffing at the familiar scents, then lay down on the cool flagstones at her feet with a heavy sigh, his tail giving a single, weary thump. He was home. And for the first time in weeks, Alara felt that maybe she was too. A few days later, as Alara was attempting to clear the overgrown path to the Springhouse, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Maeve, carrying a covered casserole dish. "Figured you might be out here," she said, her eyes taking in the scene. Alara with a pair of rusty shears, the sleeping dog, the open door of the stone building. "And I figured you might be hungry." Alara wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Maeve, you didn't have to." "Nonsense. A body's got to eat." She set the dish on a flat-topped boulder. "Your father, he always said this place was special. Said the stones held the memory of the water, and the water held the memory of the mountain. He was a poet, that one, even if he didn't know it." She looked at the Springhouse, her gaze soft with memory. "I knew he was working on something important in there. He never said what, just that it was for you. A legacy, he called it." Maeve became a quiet fixture in Alara's new life. She'd appear with food, or a thermos of hot coffee, or just to sit for a while, sharing stories of Silas that filled in the gaps the journals left behind. She taught Alara how to identify the wild herbs growing in the woods, the same ones her father had cataloged. She was a wellspring of practical, earthy knowledge, a human extension of the land itself. Word travels fast in a small town. Soon, others began to appear. Mr. Henderson, a retired stonemason who had drunk coffee with Silas at the diner every morning for 30 years, showed up one afternoon with his tools. "Your daddy helped me rebuild my chimney after the big storm of 2009, he said, not meeting her eye. "Never took a dime. Reckon I owe him." He spent the next week patiently teaching Alara how to mix mortar and repoint the crumbling stones on the south wall, his gnarled hands guiding hers. A woman who ran the local feed and supply store dropped off several bags of organic clover and wildflower seeds. "Silas always supported the small folks," she said. "He used to say, 'A field with 1,000 different flowers is stronger than a field with 1,000,000 of the same.' Figured you might need these." They came not with pity, but with a quiet, shared respect for her father, a man they had understood in ways Brenda never could. They brought their skills, their memories, their quiet support. They were helping her rebuild not just the walls of the Springhouse, but the foundation of her life. They were a community, a chosen family, bound by their love for the man who had listened to the bees. With their help, the place began to transform. The path was cleared, the walls were made solid. The overgrown clearing was tilled and planted with the seeds, creating a vibrant, chaotic meadow for the bees that were to come. Inside, Alara cleaned and organized, studying her father's notes, learning the intricate science and art of his craft. She felt his presence in every tool she touched, in every line of his handwriting. But the journals held a deeper, darker secret, one that lay buried in the final volume. As Alara read late one night, by the light of a single lantern, the pieces of her family's tragedy finally clicked into place. Her father had found proof. In a sealed section of the journal, he had detailed his final discovery. He had managed to acquire a copy of the original patent for the pesticide Agricorp's predecessor had used so heavily. It contained a list of inert ingredients, chemicals not required to be disclosed to the public. One of them was a neurotoxin, a compound known to cause the exact constellation of rare symptoms that had killed her mother. He had collected rainwater from the roof, soil from the garden, and honey from his dying hives. He'd paid a small, independent lab in another state to test them. The results were there, tucked into a sleeve in the back of the journal. They all contained traces of the same neurotoxin. He had the evidence to prove the company had poisoned his wife. But he had never used it. His last entries were filled with an agonizing self-recrimination. He had gone to a lawyer who told him he was facing a Goliath. Agricorp would bury him in legal fees. They would paint him as a grieving, unstable crank. They could take his farm, his home, everything. He had a 4-year-old daughter to raise. Paralyzed by fear of losing Ilara, fear of failing, fear of the sheer, crushing power of his enemy, he had hidden the evidence and retreated into his secret work at the Springhouse. His project with the Iron Mountain Blacks was not just an attempt to create an antidote. It was an act of penance for his own failure of nerve. "I was a coward," he wrote on the final page. "I chose silence. I let them win. Ilara, if you are reading this, you are stronger than I was. Don't be me. Don't let them erase the memory of what they did." The words were a punch to the gut. All these years, she had carried a vague, childish grief for a mother she barely knew. Now that grief had a name and a face. It was not a sickness, it was a crime. And her father's quiet, lifelong obsession was not an eccentricity. It was a burden of guilt he had carried alone for nearly 2 decades. The next morning, the sound of an engine broke the stillness of the woods. A pristine white pickup truck, the same one she'd seen at the funeral, pulled up to the edge of the clearing. Mr. Thorne got out. He was dressed in crisp khakis and a polo shirt, an outfit that looked absurdly out of place in the rustic setting. He surveyed the work they had done, the repaired wall, the newly planted meadow, with a small, tight smile. "Well, well," he said, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "Looks like you've been busy, making quite the little homestead for yourself." Ilara didn't reply. She stood by the Springhouse door, her arms crossed, Buster growling softly at her side. "Listen," Thorne said, dropping the pretense. "I'm here to make you a serious offer. Agricorp now owns all the surrounding acreage. This little 1/4 acre of yours is a nuisance, an accounting headache. We're prepared to offer you $10,000 for it. Cash. You could have a fresh start somewhere. Put a down payment on a nice apartment in the city. $10,000. It was a fortune to someone with less than $50 to her name. It was also an insult. "Why do you want it so badly?" Ilara asked, her voice quiet but steady. Thorne shrugged, a gesture of casual dismissal. "Like I said, cleaning up the property lines. We're planning a new planting cycle this spring. Need to do some significant pest mitigation before we put the seeds in. Can't have a wild, overgrown plot like this acting as a breeding ground for trouble right in the middle of our operation." The phrase hung in the air, pest mitigation. It was the same sterile euphemism her father had railed against in his journals. It meant poison. It meant crop dusters. It meant another wave of death sprayed across the land. "This land isn't for sale," Ilara said. Thorne's smile vanished. "Miss, I don't think you understand the situation. This isn't a request. We have the right to protect our investment. We'll be spraying those fields, with or without your permission. And I assure you, whatever little garden you're planting here won't survive it. Your bees, if you have any, certainly won't. Sell us the land. It's the smart play." It was a threat, delivered with the calm confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. He saw a poor, grieving girl with no resources and no power. He saw an easy victory. Ilara looked from his polished face to the stone walls of the Springhouse. the place her father had built as both a fortress and a confessional. She thought of his last words in the journal. "Don't be me." "What kind of mitigation?" she asked, her voice still quiet. It was a simple, factual question, but in the charged silence, it felt like a weapon. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "That's proprietary information. Is it the same kind you used 20 years ago?" For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He didn't know what she knew. He had expected tears or a panicked acceptance of his offer. He had not expected this quiet, unnerving stillness. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "The offer is 10,000. It's on the table until Friday. After that, we proceed as planned." He turned without another word, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the quiet air. It is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a place when a powerful man used to getting his way does not get it. It is the sound of a fuse being lit. And you, dear reader, will want to see what happens when it reaches the powder. Alara knew she had to find what her father had hidden. His last entries had been specific. "Behind the spring, the water remembers the way." She went back inside the Springhouse, her heart pounding. The spring emerged from a fissure in the back wall, a dark cleft between two massive stones. The water was icy cold. She ran her hands along the stones around the opening, pushing, probing, feeling for any give. Nothing. It was solid rock. She reread the passage in the journal. "Look for the one that doesn't belong. The stone with no moss." She brought the lantern closer. Most of the stones around the spring were slick with a fine green film of moss fed by the constant dampness. But one, just to the right of the fissure and low to the ground, was clean. It was a different type of rock, a darker, smoother granite, unlike the rough fieldstone around it. It was her father's riverstone, writ large. The honeycomb pattern was there, etched into its surface. She pushed against it. It didn't move. She pushed harder, putting her whole weight into it. With a low, grinding groan of stone on stone, it shifted inward. It wasn't a stone. It was the face of a perfectly fitted granite plug. Behind it was a dark, square opening, just big enough to crawl through. A wave of cool, still air, smelling of earth and honey and something ancient, washed over her. Taking a deep breath, she crawled into the darkness. The passage was short, only a few feet long, and opened into a small man-made chamber, a hidden vault carved out of the earth and rock behind the Springhouse wall. It was completely dark, but the air was dry and still. In the center of the chamber, on a raised stone platform, was the treasure. It was a small, nucleus hive, a miniature version of the beautiful cherry hive in the main room. It was sealed but alive. She could feel a faint, low hum emanating from within. Here, protected from the winter cold and the summer heat, kept in a state of semi-dormancy by the constant, cool temperature, was the heart of the colony. The queen, the future of the Iron Mountain Blacks. Next to the hive was a heavy, sealed metal box, an old military ammunition can. She lifted it, it was heavier than it looked, and carried it back out into the main room of the Springhouse. Her hands were shaking as she worked the latches. They were stiff, but finally popped open with a sharp, metallic clang. Inside, protected in oilcloth and sealed bags, was her father's last testament. There was a thick envelope containing his mother's medical records, documenting every symptom, every failed treatment. There were the lab reports showing the presence of the neurotoxin in the soil, the water, the honey. There were the soil and water samples themselves, sealed in heavy glass jars, the earth still dark and damp after 20 years. And on top of it all was a letter. It was addressed to her. "My dearest Alara," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found my life's work. I hope you can forgive me for the burden I am placing on you. I was a scientist in my own way, but I was not a fighter. I saw the truth, but I was afraid to speak it aloud. I built these walls to protect my bees, but they also became my hiding place. This box contains the proof, The truth of what happened to your mother. It is a heavy truth to carry. He explained everything, his fear, his guilt, his hope that the bees and their honey could be a kind of redemption, a healing force in a poisoned world. He urged her to use the evidence, to fight the battle he had run from. They will tell you that you are small, he wrote. They will tell you that you are powerless. Do not believe them. The smallest bee carries the pollen that creates the forest. You carry the truth. That is the only power that matters. Whatever you choose to do, know that I loved you more than words can say. You are my best and most beautiful creation. She folded the letter and put it back in the box. The choice was clear. There was no choice at all. She would not sell. She would not run. She would finish what her father had started. She would make them remember. The county zoning board meeting was held on a Wednesday night in the basement of the old courthouse. The room was stuffy and paneled in dark wood, with fluorescent lights that cast a sickly yellow pallor on the proceedings. The board members, 5 local farmers and business owners, sat at a raised dais, looking tired and impatient. The audience was a mix of landowners, AgriCorp employees in their crisp company shirts, and a few concerned citizens. Ilara sat in the front row, with Maeve on one side and Mr. Henderson on the other. In a canvas bag at her feet was the metal box. Mr. Thorne, representing AgriCorp, was the first to speak. He was smooth and confident, armed with a PowerPoint presentation full of colorful charts and reassuring statistics. He spoke of progress, of efficiency, of maximizing yields to feed a hungry world. He talked about their new, advanced crop protection solutions, a phrase that sounded clean and modern. He assured the board that the aerial spraying was perfectly safe, that it would be targeted, that the drift would be minimal. He promised jobs. He promised an increase in the county's tax base. He painted a picture of a prosperous, scientific future, and he made it sound irresistible. When he was finished, a few of the AgriCorp employees applauded. Then the board chairman, a florid-faced man named Peterson, looked at his list. Next up for public comment, Ilara Vance. A murmur went through the room. Ilara walked to the wooden lectern at the front of the room. She looked small and young, dressed in a simple cotton dress, her hands clutching a few sheets of paper. Thorne watched her with a look of amused contempt. He thought he knew how this would go. A few minutes of tearful, emotional pleading, easily dismissed. My name is Ilara Vance, she began, her voice quiet but clear, carrying through the silent room. My father was Silas Vance. Some of you knew him. He kept bees on the quarter-acre plot of land that borders the AgriCorp property on the West Ridge. She paused, letting the silence settle. She did not look at Thorne. She looked at the faces of the board members, men whose families had farmed this land for generations. Mr. Thorne talks about progress and crop protection. I want to talk about memory. Land has a memory. Water has a memory. And for 20 years, AgriCorp and companies like it have been trying to make this land forget. She opened the metal box and placed one of the glass jars of soil on the lectern. This is soil from my family's land. It was collected 20 years ago. My father collected it. She placed a second jar next to it. This is water from the spring that runs through our property, also from 20 years ago. She held up the lab reports. My father had these samples tested. They contained traces of an organophosphate neurotoxin. It was an ingredient in a pesticide called Agridex 7, used heavily on the cornfields next to our property back then. An ingredient that was not listed on the public label. Thorne stood up. Mr. Chairman, this is irrelevant. This is ancient history. We don't even use that product anymore. Peterson waved him down. Let her finish. Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength. That same neurotoxin is known to cause a rare neurological disorder. The same disorder that killed my mother, Annalise Vance, when I was 4 years old. A gasp went through the room. The tired boredom on the faces of the board members was replaced by a sharp, focused attention. This was no longer about zoning permits. It was about their own history, their own families. Agricorp says its new chemicals are safe. That's what the company that came before them said, too. They say they want to clean up the property lines. What they want is to silence the last piece of land that remembers what they did. My father kept this evidence because he was afraid to fight. But he also kept something else. She reached into her bag and brought out a small, clear jar. Inside was a piece of honeycomb, dark and glistening, submerged in the almost black honey of the Iron Mountain bees. My father spent the last 20 years of his life saving a strain of bees native to these mountains. Bees that were thought to be extinct. He saved them because they are resilient. They learn to live with the poison. They learn to make something that heals. She looked directly at the board. You can approve this permit. You can let them spray their new poisons and pretend it's progress. Or you can decide that some things are worth more than profit. You can decide to listen to the memory of the land. She finished and walked back to her seat. The room was utterly still. The silence was deafening. Mr. Thorne's confident smirk was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped fury. The chairman cleared his throat. He looked at the other board members, who were whispering among themselves. He looked at Thorne, then back at Alara. The board will table this permit application, he announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. Pending a full and independent environmental review. We'll be subpoenaing Agricorp's historical records on chemical usage in this county. He banged his gavel. Meeting adjourned. It was a stunning, absolute victory. As the room erupted in conversation, Maeve hugged Alara tightly. Mr. Henderson clapped her on the shoulder, his eyes wet. People she didn't even know came up to thank her, to share their own stories of sick livestock or strange illnesses. They had found their voice in hers. The story of the meeting, of the beekeeper's daughter who stood up to the chemical giant, was in the local paper the next day. The state environmental agency launched an investigation. Thorne was suspended, and Agricorp was suddenly facing a past it had spent millions to bury. A few weeks later, a car Alara didn't recognize pulled up to the Springhouse. It was Brenda. She got out of the car hesitantly, looking smaller and older than Alara remembered. She was holding a worn wooden box. I saw the article, she said, avoiding Alara's eyes. I never knew. About your mother. About any of it. He never talked about it. Alara said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was always so quiet, Brenda continued, her voice trembling slightly. Off in his own world with those bees. I thought he was wasting his life. I didn't understand. I saw everything in dollars and cents. That's how I was raised. I don't expect you to forgive me. She held out the wooden box. I kept these. I don't know why. They seemed too personal to sell. Alara took the box and opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, were her father's carving knives. A small, beautiful set with cherry wood handles, their blades honed to a razor's edge. He had used them for the fine, detailed work on his hives, for carving the tiny symbols he used to mark his frames. It was the most intimate part of his craft. Thank you, Alara said, the words feeling strange and inadequate. Brenda nodded, a jerky, awkward motion. The garden looks nice, she said, gesturing to the meadow of wildflowers. Lots of weeds, though. It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. A week later, Brenda's car was there again. She didn't come to the door. Alara found her at the edge of the meadow, on her hands and knees, methodically pulling up thistle and dockweed. They worked in silence for an hour, two women separated by years of misunderstanding, finding a tentative, fragile peace in the shared humble labor of tending the earth. With the threat of Agricorp gone, the Springhouse became a place of vibrant life. Alara, with Maeve's guidance, carefully transferred the queen and her colony from the hidden chamber to the beautiful cherry hive in the center of the room. The Iron Mountain blacks thrived. They filled the meadow with their low, contented hum. Their dark, healing honey began to fill the jars on the shelves. Maeve's grandson, a quiet 10-year-old named Leo, started spending his afternoons at the Springhouse. He was fascinated by the bees, unafraid of their power. Elara taught him how to move slowly, how to listen to the sounds of the hive. She showed him her father's journals, taught him the names of the plants her father had charted. She gave him his own small smoker to polish and his own hive tool to keep. One afternoon, she took him to the creek behind the Springhouse and showed him how to find the smoothest stones. She placed her father's honeycomb river stone in his small palm. "My father used to say, 'This stone remembered the water,'" she told him. "And the water remembers the mountain." Leo traced the hexagonal pattern with his finger, his face full of a solemn wonder. The legacy was passing, from hand to hand, from one generation to the next. Dusk settled over the valley, turning the sky to shades of bruised purple and soft rose. Elara sat on the stone step of the Springhouse, the place of her inheritance, the heart of her world. Buster lay at her feet, his head on her lap, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the flagstones. The air was cool and sweet, alive with the sound of the bees returning home, their legs heavy with the pollen that would build the future. The light from the open door cast a warm golden rectangle onto the thriving meadow. In her hand she held the river stone, its surface warm from the last rays of the sun. She thought of her father, of his fear and his courage, of his quiet, patient love that had taken the form of stone and wood and the hum of a million tiny wings. He had left her not a pile of rocks, but a living truth. He had left her a reason. She looked out at the darkening woods, at the world she had fought to protect, and whispered his words into the gathering twilight, a promise to him and to herself. Some things you don't keep for what they're worth. You keep them for what they remember.